Good morning from Downing Street, where we are on air with this special election results programme. In just over an hour's time, Sir Keir Starmer is expected to arrive to take his place here as the 58th British Prime Minister, only the fourth Labour leader to win a majority. This country has overnight undergone a seismic political transformation. Labour has more than doubled its seats, returning over 400 MPs to Westminster. The Conservatives reduced to a rump, clinging on to just 120 constituencies. Cabinet ministers, leadership contenders and former Prime Minister Liz Truss defenestrated as voters delivered a brutal verdict on 14 years of Tory rule. Historic nights too for Reform, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. But while the incoming Prime Minister spoke overnight of a weight lifted, a burden removed, there are storm clouds over his premiership already. He inherits a huge set of economic challenges, a series of international conflicts, a global climate crisis and record levels of illegal migration that powered Reform's vote. In what's being called a loveless landslide, a sizable minority of voters stayed at home and several Labour seats were won by independent candidates, reflecting disgruntlement over Sir Keir's policy towards Gaza, disgruntlement which boiled over at the count in Jess Phillips' Birmingham Yardley constituency.
This election has been... Can you throw them out?
For the Scottish National Party. The SNP lost dozens of seats to Labour as the map turned from yellow to red. We'll have the latest from Edinburgh. Big celebrations at the Lib Dems headquarters as Sir Ed Davey hails the party's best result for a century and says there was a serious message behind the famous stunts. Reform now have 4 MPs, including the party leader Nigel Farage, successful in his 8th attempt at becoming an MP. But they came second in 98 seats and warn Labour, we are coming for you. An historic result for the Greens too, who now have 4 MPs, quadrupling their representation in the House of Commons. And a night of seismic change in Wales and Northern Ireland too.
So after this historic night in British politics, the morning after, Sir Keir Starmer hailing what he called the sunshine of hope. He's due to speak to the country here in Downing Street at around 12:25. The Liberal Democrats scored their best result for a century, while the Tories had their worst result in their history. Rishi Sunak a few minutes ago admitting, "I am sorry." With just a few seats left to declare, we can see how Britain's political landscape has undergone a complete transformation in the past 24 hours. The Conservative landslide of 2019 wiped out by a Labour one. In terms of seats, Labour have 412 MPs. The Conservatives are slashed to just 121. The Lib Dems become the third largest party in Westminster with 71 seats. Reform have 4. It was a devastating night for the SNP, who won just 9 seats, but a good one for the Greens with 4. And Plaid Cymru also have 4 seats. All this delivers Sir Keir Starmer a majority of at least 168. Well, as we've already seen, that is a stark contrast to 2019. Labour have more than doubled their seats, while the Tories are down to less than a third of their previous total. Vote share is also crucial to look at here, with Reform winning a far higher share than they did seats. And if you compare that to the last general election, while the Conservatives lost a big share of the vote, Labour only secured 1.6% more and yet won a huge majority of seats. Here's our senior political correspondent, Paul McNamara.
This wasn't just victory, it was an historic one.
Thank you.
A seismic shift that moved the tectonic plates of UK politics, and a moment worthy of breaking an ironclad adherence to cautious messaging, and invoking rare, raw emotion from the man who is soon to be Prime Minister.
We did it! You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now. And it feels good, I have to be honest. 4.5 years of work changing the party. This is what it is for. A changed Labour Party, ready to serve our country, ready to restore Britain to the service of working people.
To gain a majority of just one after defeat in 2019 required the largest swing since 1997. Sir Keir Starmer and his Labour government now have a majority of more than 170. But that historic win mirrored and flipped upside down by devastating defeat on Downing Street. The outgoing Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, leading the Conservatives to their worst ever result.
To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change.
The first result of the night set the tone for what was to come.
Richard Maeve Phillipson, 18,837.
An unsurprising victory for the woman expected to be Labour's Education Secretary.
But the figure that you will not get over is the party that is in second place there. Nearly 12,000 votes for reform.
Almost 2 years after her own MPs ousted her as leader, Liz Truss's constituents did the same. The former Prime Minister joining the Defence Secretary Grant Shapps, Education Secretary Gillian Keegan, and Leader of the House of Commons Penny Mordaunt in losing their seats. All in, 8 members of the Cabinet gone.
Tonight, the Conservative Party has taken a battering because it failed to honour the trust that people had placed in it.
And this is the man that aided many of those defeats.
Yeah, pretty good.
Nigel Farage, elected to Parliament on his 8th attempt.
Some of our results across the whole of the county are truly extraordinary.
Reform UK wielded power over what remains of the Conservatives that far exceeds their 4 MPs.
Well, the ones in the Conservative Party that actually agree with us, will have to come and join us.
Do you think they'll still exist?
They've been around for 190 years. They've been amazingly resilient, but this could be I think this is the beginning of the end of the Conservative Party as we've all grown up and known it.
Start cheering now!
And they have reason to cheer. The Liberal Democrats now have 71 MPs after big gains in the Tory blue wall. It's the most MPs of their modern era, and after a campaign full of fun and stunts, sober sincerity.
I want to thank people for trusting us again. We will not let you down.
Despite the final tally, it wasn't all Labour wins though. The Green Party took 4 seats, including Bristol Central, beating the woman Labour planned to make their culture secretary.
24,000.
In Islington North, Jeremy Corbyn won as an independent, beating the party he used to lead.
They're also looking for a government that on the world stage will search for peace, not war, and not allow the terrible conditions to go on that are happening in Gaza.
He's one of 4 independents that won largely on a pro-Palestinian platform. This was a night when the Conservative Party was punished by voters after 14 years in power and a 6-week campaign in disarray. Craig Williamson bet on the timing of the election and is being investigated by the Gambling Commission for it. He denies any wrongdoing. Voters last night said they don't care. He was dispatched along with every other Conservative MP in Wales. And in Scotland, this, the rare glimmer of hope for the SNP. They lost almost 40 seats, but beat the Scottish Conservative leader, Douglas Ross. For the survivors of this disaster, thoughts to who should lead them next. The campaigning began before dawn had even broken.
I'm sorry that my party didn't listen to you. The Conservative Party has let you down.
This is a landslide victory, but a landslide in seats, not votes, picking up just 1/3 of the vote share. Conservatives today clinging on to that fact in desperation. For Labour, just jubilation. because after 14 years in the wilderness, Sir Keir Starmer becomes only the 7th ever Labour Prime Minister.
Poor McNamara there. Well, about half an hour ago, Rishi Sunak came out of Downing Street here. We could hear huge amounts of applause, long bouts of applause actually. And he came out and delivered that very gracious speech that we saw there. He's now entered the palace. It's become a kind of recent custom actually that the family of the outgoing Prime Minister is invited in to meet the monarch. So Rishi Sunak, accompanied by his wife, holding her umbrella, not taking any chances with the weather. And it is this really seamless transition. It's something that foreign journalists reporting here have been remarking on all morning. The fact that, unlike a lot of other countries, it is a seamless handover. So any minute now, Keir Starmer will be heading to the palace to be given that commission from the King to become the 58th Prime Minister of this country. Let's go now to Jackie in Westminster.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Labour frontbencher Liz Kendall and asked how it feels to be in power after so long.
It feels like an incredible victory, and I am so proud of Kier and the whole team, and we know we've got to roll our sleeves up and get going straight away, but just for now it's a huge win, and it is down to Keir Starmer changing the Labour Party fundamentally. And if you'd asked me the morning after the 2019 election whether we would ever have been here, I wouldn't have believed it, but we've done that.
An emotional day.
Really. I mean, because for all the cynicism, I'm in this to change people's lives. Most people go into politics to change the world. And we've got a chance now, and we've got to prove to people, because they do want change. They want it desperately, but we've got to prove to them it's possible.
I mean, every single shadow minister, every candidate who came out was very, very careful to tell us all we're taking nothing for granted.
And we didn't.
But deep behind the scenes, is this what you expected? Is this what you were sort of banking on?
I didn't, but I'm a child of my political upbringing. I remember the morning after the 92 election where I really thought we'd win, and I was so devastated when we didn't. In fact, that was the morning I joined the Labour Party. But we didn't stop fighting to the last minute when we targeted our resources on the seats we needed to win, not just because we want a strong majority for change, but because we believe Labour MPs are better.
But I mean, the reality is our political editor Gary Gibbon described it as a landslide, but a loveless landslide. Low turnout, share of the vote for you unchanged in England.
No, I'm afraid I disagree with that analysis, because I think it's actually a testament to our strategy, which is I don't want to pile up votes in existing Labour seats.
So very tactical.
It was a strategy to win. And as I said, it's not just so that we get a majority so we can put our principles into practice. It's because we see the difference that Labour MPs make to people's lives.
But the share of the vote unchanged in England, it's gone down in Wales.
But the scale of the victory, winning in places that I never thought possible, in Suffolk, in Aldershot. But let me say, we know that we have to earn people's trust.
Just on the numbers and some of the defeats, because this was not without its defeats for Labour. You lost Jonathan Ashworth to a pro-Palestinian candidate, Khalid Mahmood. An ongoing row over Labour's response to Gaza that won't go away. That will be a problem for the new Prime Minister.
And I take I take those losses seriously. And my view has always been that you don't tell voters they're wrong when they give you a message. You listen to them.
But they did tell you, and many of them would argue that Keir Starmer didn't listen to them.
And we know that we have to do more to earn back their trust. They don't take away from that quite historic victory that we have seen.
Were there mistakes made on that?
No, I think what I've seen is just how volatile politics is, which is why we are very proud of our campaign and this mandate for change. But we also know how quickly things can change.
But on the very specific issue of Gaza, mistakes made by the party, how will they deal with it now?
Well, I think that we have to show our passion about improving the lives of people in Palestine, and the way that we believe that will happen, the way that we will have a safe and secure Palestinian state We have to have those two-state solutions, safe and secure, alongside
The
them.
party was criticised, noises off from within for its so-called Ming-Vei's strategy, not really taking any risks, not really talking about any radical policies. Does that change today with this victory?
So, no, we campaigned as a change Labour Party and we will govern as a change
So not a
Labour
radical
Party.
Labour Party.
But listen, what all great reforming Labour governments have made huge changes. If I look back at the creation of the NHS, the welfare state, the Equal Pay Act, great changes that the Labour government makes. So change is hard, but it's possible.
Kendall, thanks very much for talking
Pleasure.
to us. Thank you very much. Well, joining me now is Sir Charles Walker, who represented Broxbourne for the Tories for almost 20 years. I asked Liz Kendall what it feels like to be in power after so long. What does it feel like now to be out of power after so long? A terrible, terrible night for your party.
It was an awful night for the Conservative Party. There is no way of sugarcoating the pill. And unless I say that electoral calculus had us on 61 seats on Wednesday in its final poll of polls, and we managed to come back with 122, but that is still a woeful
You'd
performance.
be grasping at straws.
Yeah, I'm really not saying this was a good night in any way. It wasn't a good night. I'm devastated. I'm devastated for my colleagues who've lost their seats, their staff, the Prime Minister. It's just been a really, really bad night for the Conservative Party.
Former Prime Minister out, Theresa May's seat is gone, David Cameron's seat gone. The level and the nature of this defeat is enormous, isn't it?
It's huge. I think it's the greatest defeat the Conservative Party has ever suffered in its history. Now, I think we can come back from it, but that's going to require a huge amount of discipline over the weeks, months and years ahead, and I'm just not sure my party has the capacity to demonstrate discipline.
And first of all, it also requires an understanding of where you went wrong and at what point you went wrong. Rishi Sunak today looking and sounding devastated, apologising to the British people. He says he takes full responsibility for the loss, but it's beyond one campaign, isn't it, here?
Look, this is a collective enterprise. The Conservative Party must take responsibility for this loss. The Conservative Party put Boris Johnson into number 10. We did a deal with the devil there. Boris has huge political skills, but he also came with huge downsides. When that didn't work out, we put Liz Truss there for 48 days, which was an absolute disaster. And that's when we blew our reputation entirely for sound money. And financial responsibility, and the British public are really very, very cross with us.
But also there's an issue for many people about integrity. You had Partygate, you had Boris Johnson found guilty of lying to Parliament, you had Gambling Gate, as it became known as. Do you accept that in the end, for some people, it was that lack of integrity that did for you?
Of course I accept that. I don't think it was the main issue. I think Gambling Gate was probably overplayed, but I certainly think the goings on at number 10 during lockdown had a huge impact or significant impact on the nation's psyche. I don't think there's any equivalence, in all honesty, between what went on at number 10 and a few MPs placing bets on the outcome of a general election. As bad as that was, we weren't denying people the right then to see their dying relatives as we were during lockdown.
And no doubt about the damage done to your party last night by Reform. Where does that go now?
Reform's performance was fantastic for Reform and devastating for the Conservatives. There is no pushback on any of the questions you're asking me. The Conservative Party needs to own collectively a dreadful result.
But where does it go now, given what Reform have done?
What I hope it does now, it goes to ground, actually, and does a bit of thinking for the next 6 months, because the danger is we think, actually, if we just move to the right, let's chase after this Nigel Farage chap's vote, we'll get a short-term sugar rush. But the danger is people will say, well, why should I be voting for sort of Reform-light Tory when I could get full-fat Nigel?
But there's real danger there, isn't
there? There is
because
danger.
The tendency in the past has been to do that, hasn't it?
Quick fixes. We all love a quick fix. Quick fixes tend to, as I say, you get a real rush, and then you get a very heavy down, a big hangover.
And will Rishi Sunak stay on as leader? And if he doesn't, who are the big beasts that are left? We saw Suella Braverman last night. We listened to her speech.
Well, you mentioned the big beasts. I don't put her in that category. But I hope the Prime Minister does remain. Sorry, well, he is still the Prime Minister, isn't he, for the next
Briefly.
Briefly, yeah. So I hope Rishi Sunak remains leading our party through the summer recess. We should have a leadership contest, perhaps in the autumn, back end of the autumn, with a new leader in place before Christmas. I think that would be the earliest we would want to do any of these things.
So Charles Walker, thanks very much for talking to us this morning.
Thank you for having me on.
Now, back to Kathy.
Thanks, Jackie. Well, Rishi Sunak is currently in Buckingham Palace, Rishi Sunak is currently in Buckingham Palace and he is tendering his resignation to the King right as we speak. In about an hour's time, Sir Keir Starmer will sweep up Downing Street and he will then sweep into number 10 here. We now have Rishi Sunak is now leaving Buckingham Palace. These are live pictures you're seeing. The car is emerging from the gates and there will then be this seamless handover of power that we were talking about earlier. So that is Rishi Sunak. He went in there as Prime Minister. He's emerged as plain and simple Rishi Sunak. And Keir Starmer will now go in to meet the King and be appointed Prime Minister. And then he will return to Downing Street here and he will get to grips with the business of being Prime Minister. That's the scene outside Buckingham Palace. A lot of people gathered. Despite the risk of rain, they're gathering to watch this historic moment. He's only the 7th Labour Prime Minister, so it is an extraordinary day of history that is unfolding before us. And when he arrives here at number 10, he will get to grips with this incredibly onerous in-tray of policy challenges that he has. One of those, top of the in-tray really, is getting growth back into the economy. And the UK is likely to have its first female Chancellor of the Exchequer. Rachel Reeves will have an absolutely packed agenda to deal with, not least the cost of living crisis. Here is our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, in Downing Street with me. Helia, tell us.
Well, look, Kathy, big majority, big problems, and work will really only start today. Both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves will have to face into the big challenges at the heart of the British economy. NHS waiting lists, prisons at full capacity, a housing crisis, a water sewage catastrophe. But the biggest one, as you said, is growth. Earlier we heard from Rishi Sunak that growth has returned, but that's a rather generous description. Since 2019, growth has only edged up 1.8%. To give you some context, the last time Labour were in power, in the Blair-Brown years, they would have got that in less than a year. And why does it matter? Because of our standard of living. Last Parliament was the first time Britons in modern history ever saw their standard of living go backwards. That whole dream, Kathy, that the next generation would have better prosperity, better public services, that unfortunately has crashed. So we might be at the tail end of the cost of living crisis, but the in-tray for the new residents of this street is going to be brutal, almost by every metric. But let me pick one for you. Debt to GDP back in 1997, that stood at 37.6%. Today, it's 99.8%. But perhaps this morning you got a bit of that sunlight of hope because the markets took it in their stride that we have this new government, indeed a Labour government. The pound edged up ever so slightly. The FTSE 250, which is a good bellwether for the UK economy, full of things like house builders, that added £36 billion to its value. But perhaps what will make the cabinet smile the most is the fact that Goldman Sachs, the US investment bank, gave its verdict on Securonomics, upgrading growth. But don't forget, in the context of all of that, Kathy, 1945, massive transformation. 1997, profound change, things like the independence of the Bank of England. The big question for Starmer and Rachel Reeves is going to be, will the economy change, and will it change enough?
Helia, thanks very much. Well, we are awaiting the arrival of the new Prime Minister here in Downing Street. The police officers just gone down the street to be at the gates waiting for his arrival from Buckingham Palace, where he's meeting the King to be appointed the 58th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Let's go now to Scotland, where the SNP had an absolutely catastrophic night, losing a huge swathe of seats as the map turned from yellow to red. With one seat left to declare, Labour has gone from just 1 to 37, while the SNP is down to 9. In fact, the SNP has lost almost the same number of seats as Labour has gained, while the Tories have just one fewer than last time around. Well, let's get the very latest from our Scotland correspondent, Catherine Sampson. Catherine.
Yes, a devastating result for the SNP. Scottish Labour sweeping them out of Edinburgh, sweeping them out of Glasgow. Now, John Swinney has been in Leith this morning at a press conference which really felt like it had the atmosphere of a wake. He says he takes full responsibility for these results. But look, he only took over as leader a few weeks before this campaign started. And there are some who really are questioning if, much like Rishi Sunak perhaps, John Swinney is someone who is also paying the price for some of the actions of his predecessors, most particularly Nicola Sturgeon, her independent strategy, her sudden resignation, that police investigation into SNP party finances in which she denies any wrongdoing. I asked John Swinney this morning, has he spoken to Nicola Sturgeon about this result, and does he blame her?
Well, I've not spoken to Nicola this morning because obviously I've had lots of things on and lots of media demands to deal with and other issues to address. In relation to, I don't blame any. I've just said I take full responsibility. So that's me. That's what leadership's about. You take responsibility for what lies in front of you and you deal with it. In relation to the question of independence, we've got to take stock after last night because people have given a greater priority to removing a Tory government than to arguing for independence, and we have to reflect on that. We've got to consider the implications of that and determine how we proceed as a party, and we'll do so through the type of open, collaborative discussion that I talked about.
Well, John Swinney insists independence is still on the table, but it is hard to see why Keir Starmer's government will feel any pressure over this as his party celebrates their remarkable revival here.
Scottish Labour have a lot to celebrate. Arriving at a victory event in Glasgow, there was a rock-star welcome for their leader Anna Sarwar. Once a Labour heartland, the city switched to the SNP after the independence referendum. Now it's red again, and so is Edinburgh.
What they're going to wake up to today is the end of 14 years of chaos from the Tories. They're going to have a huge weight lifted off their shoulders because they know the journey for change has now begun. Having decency, honesty and integrity back into our politics is itself so important.
The first significant moment for Labour in Scotland came when former Cabinet Minister Douglas Alexander, who lost his seat in 2015, found out he would be returning to Westminster. The scale of Labour's victory shocked the SNP, sweeping away even prominent SNP figures like Joanna Cherry in Edinburgh. Polls had put the two parties neck and neck. But this result has ended more than a decade of SNP dominance at Westminster. John Swinney, the party's third leader in 2 years, put independence on page 1 of his manifesto, calling the election an opportunity to intensify pressure on Westminster for another vote if the party won a majority of seats. That's now a memory. Instead, he's pledging a period of soul-searching. He posted on social media, "This is a very difficult night for the SNP. We need to learn from the public and pick ourselves back up." It was a very nervous night for the party's Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn. He held on in Aberdeen South, but there was little to celebrate as he sees his contingent of MPs shrink from the third biggest in Parliament to one of the smallest.
We must listen to what the people of Scotland have told us. But when you are knocked down, you have to get back up.
The Scottish Conservatives leader Douglas Ross lost his seat. A reform vote playing a role in that, brought down partly by his own U-turn. After saying he would quit Westminster for Holyrood, he ended up running in a seat where a colleague was barred from standing due to ill health and announced mid-campaign he'd be quitting as party leader after this election.
A significant chunk of voters went for reform, and that has allowed the SNP to win the seat. But I also share my responsibility. I took a decision to stand here. I also led the party's campaign nationally, so I'm not shirking from that either.
When the celebrations fade, Labour now has to deliver for Scotland with an eye on the Scottish Parliament election in 2026. Its first serious run at winning in more than a decade.
Well, I'm joined now by our senior political correspondent, Paul McNamara, and the psophologist, Luke Trill from More in Common. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. I mean, we can see the big picture, massive victory for Labour, defeat for the Tories, but that hides a lot of nuances, doesn't it?
Yeah, that top-line result, that huge Labour majority, worst defeat for the Conservatives in their history, is masking a lot that's going on underneath the surface. What we actually saw last night was British politics splintering left, right and centre. Labour got that huge majority on just 34% of the vote or so. You know, that is a tiny vote share for such a big majority. And what we saw is voters going to Reform UK, going to the Greens, and in some cases going to these so-called Gaza independents, which meant despite big Labour gains, they actually lost seats in some places.
I mean, Labour very keen to play down this idea of share as, you know, just say a win is a win. But it's problematic going forward, isn't it?
Yeah, the one place I've heard the exact same messaging as just that is talking to Conservative, well, former MPs now this morning and texting with a few of them. And there's almost, that's like the one fact that they're lynching onto, that, you know, out of their dead bear claw, are you taking that facts away? It's, you know, it's only 1.5% more votes that Labour got as opposed to last election, which was a horrific defeat for them. So that number is being shared around by Tories saying, look, it's not all lost for us yet, we could come back.
But the striking thing is that this matches exactly what we heard in our focus groups, which was people were desperate to get rid of the Tories. They just weren't that enthusiastic about the alternative. This was a, we may as well roll the dice on Labour rather than a wholehearted embrace of Keir Starmer. And so I think what he's going to have to do now is turn that big majority into actually delivering not just on policy, but that disillusionment that we're seeing from voters across the country.
I mean, reform causing problems for both parties going forward, yes?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no getting away from that. And I mean, it's almost 100 seats that Reform came second. Their impact on the Conservative Party this election has been huge. Their impact on the Conservative Party for the next 5 years has also the potential to be even bigger.
But there's no doubt they also picked up some former Labour voters as well to get those big vote shares. And we heard in Nigel Farage's victory speech, I'm coming after Labour next. So Labour are going to have to defend their right flank and their left flank going forward.
So what does politics look like going forward?
Busy. Still really busy. I mean, it's undoubtedly easier for Keir Starmer. He does have a whopping great big majority, but you know, the economy he inherits isn't one that is going to fill you with optimism and fill you with joy that, great, he's going to be able to deliver things right from day one.
And in terms of the Liberal Democrats, we have to give them their day.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is a historic result for the Liberal Democrats. Right across that so-called blue wall, they took out formerly safe Conservative seats, establishing themselves as the main opposition party in the south of England. And of course, that's going to change politics too, because there's that pressure from the centre in Parliament now as well.
And in terms of the whole picture over the next few months, you know, obviously there's a lot of people within Labour who want Labour to be radical now that they have this massive majority. How likely is that, given all these noises off?
Go on, you.
Well, look, I mean, we asked voters just before the election, how long do Labour have to turn things around, to make you feel better? And the average answer was under a year. So whatever Labour do, they're going to have to move quick.
What are Labour saying to you?
At the moment, do you know what? It's not just the last during the election campaign. It had genuinely been over the last couple of years. There's been that adherence to, no, we don't take any vote for granted. They have been steadfast in keeping to that messaging. This morning, there's almost just been a euphoria and a relief, just, we've actually done it. It wasn't that long ago we were talking about hung parliament territories. Now we're talking about record majorities.
But when you've campaigned on change, that change needs to come quickly, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. And the number one issue for voters that they say they'll judge Labour's success on is NHS waiting lists. So likely new Health Secretary Wes Streeting is going to have his work cut out there.
Luke Trill, Paul McNamara. We may come back to you later if we have more time, but thank you very much for joining us right now. Well, the Lib Dem leader, Sir Ed Davey, thanked his supporters this morning for helping the party get its best result for over 100 years. We've been out in Harrogate, one of the seats the Lib Dems took from the Tories, to hear from voters there.
I don't even think a lot of people looked at what they had to offer. I think the damage was done and it was always going to happen.
I guess the Conservatives just let everybody down. So it was, where do we go now? We went to Reform, people went to Liberal Democrats.
I went for Lib Dems. I wanted the Tories out. That was my main reason.
I think everyone's just rejected the Conservative government, haven't they, completely, wholeheartedly, sadly.
And earlier I spoke to the Lib Dems deputy leader, Daisy Cooper, who won her St Albans seat last night with an increased majority. But I started by asking her about the national result for the Lib Dems.
This is a record level result for Liberal Democrats and the best result ever for our party. We're incredibly humbled that so many people put their faith and trust in us by voting for us in this election, but we're also incredibly excited. And what I can say to every single person who voted for us and so many more around the country, our message to the entire country is that we are going to put the NHS and social care front and centre of everything we do in the next Parliament.
It's interesting that you mentioned those couple of issues, because people were divided about the campaign, a series of stunts every day. It clearly worked in terms of the profile, perhaps, but a significant proportion of voters undoubtedly voting for you to get the Tories out.
Well, look, what we heard on the doorstep was there were huge numbers of people who were voting for us positively because they liked the fact that we had a plan to save our NHS, to take real action on the cost of living and to protect our local environment. But absolutely, we know that there were people who were voting tactically in this election because fundamentally people were sick to the back teeth of this Conservative government, and where we were the key challengers, they were prepared to vote for us. And look at the result. We now have a record level of Liberal Democrat MPs.
What do you do about the fact now you're mainly a party of southern England, winning Tory seats with, an anti-Tory campaign, get them out? How do you keep those people on board?
Look, we've had some fantastic results around the home counties, but we're also back in the West Country as well. We've got seats like Westmoreland and places like Hazel Grove, not far from Manchester, and we've got seats in Scotland. So we actually have
how do you keep them on board?
Well, because every single Liberal Democrat MP is going to be a champion for their local area. That's what we're known for. We're known for putting our constituents first. We're known for putting our constituencies first, and we'll campaign to protect local health services wherever they are within the UK.
And a lot of people pointing to the fact no VAT on private school fees makes a lot of sense.
Well, look, we have said as a matter of principle that we don't support that policy because we simply believe that you should not put VAT on education. But we have very ambitious plans for our schools here in England. We want there to be free school meals, more funding per head, fixing the SEND crisis as well. So we've got a very ambitious set of proposals for fixing the crisis in our schools without having to take that particular measure.
And do you think, how do you put pressure on a Labour government to do all of those things?
Well, if you look at the last Parliament, where we were a very small parliamentary party, we were leading and winning the battle of ideas. So we were the first party to call for the windfall tax, and then that was copied by Labour and then the Conservatives. First party to call for the energy price hike to be scrapped, copied by Labour and the Conservatives, and likewise with our proposals to tackle the sewage scandal as well. So we managed to do that with just 15 MPs. Now we have 70. So I'm in no doubt that we're going to have a much stronger voice and a lot more influence.
Less concerned now about how the electoral system works. Reform got way more votes than you, less than a 15th of the seats. An electoral system you've railed against for years, working for you now.
Well, we are always concerned about this electoral system because it isn't a fair electoral system.
It's worked well for you this time.
But only because we decided we had to play within the rules, and that's what we did. But fundamentally, it's still unfair. As a point of principle, as a point of our democracy, we do believe that every single vote should matter. Every single vote should count in a general election. And under this very unfair system, that isn't the case.
But it's an unfair system that has worked very well for you this time. Given that, does that drop this down your list of priorities now?
No, of course it doesn't. It's been in our manifesto in every single election for decades and decades and decades, and it will remain in our manifesto for as long as we have to campaign for it.
I mean, we look at reform in a huge number of independents now, a very, very fractured opposition. Is that a problem?
Well, time will tell, won't it? But what I can say for the Liberal Democrats is that we will be a very united party in Parliament, and we will campaign to fix our NHS, to fix our social care system, tackle the cost of living crisis and put an end to the sewage dumping scandal.
But, I mean, how do you work as an opposition given the very disparate nature of the opposition now?
Well, time will tell how that works out, but fundamentally, we are a much larger party. We're now the third largest party in British politics. We will have a much stronger voice, and we will be campaigning on those issues that the public have told us are important, like the NHS.
Daisy Cooper, thanks very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Well, we're currently in a strange limbo because we do not have a Prime Minister at the moment. This is the situation. The previous Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has left office. The incoming Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, is going to travel to Buckingham Palace and be given the job by the King. But currently the monarch has executive power. So we'll be in this limbo, not for very long, but that is the situation at the moment. Let's go to Wales, where it is a story of complete Conservative wipeout, where the party was left without a single seat. Out of the 32 seats in Wales, Labour picked up 27. Plaid Cymru now has 4 MPs and the Liberal Democrats have 1. Among the Tory losers, 4 former Welsh secretaries, including David T.C. Davies, whose Monmouthshire seat went to Labour. Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davies is in Monmouth for us. And Andy, I gather it stopped raining there, and there's a little break in the clouds here too.
Yeah, no rain, and you might be able to hear a little bit of cheers behind me. That's Labour's new MPs in Wales gathering for an event to thank campaigners. Frankly, they should be gathering for another event to thank the Tories for their utter collapse, because what they witnessed overnight was a complete rout of their Conservative opponents. There are no more Conservative MPs in Wales, and that is a huge psychological boost to Welsh Labour here. Why are they in Monmouth? Well, it was in the early hours that the then Tory Secretary of State, David T.C. Davies, walked into his count, effectively conceding that he had already lost. And so it was. And Welsh Conservatives have now lost a very senior figure in the party. David, the Tory Tornado Davies, that was his boxing name, has been a formidable presence in the party in Wales, ever ready to take on the Labour government here in Wales. He's now gone, so too those former Welsh secretaries, Alan Cairns, Stephen Crabb and Simon Hart, the chief whip. So too, as we've heard, Craig Williams, embroiled in the betting scandal, and the Labour candidate who beat him in supposedly the Tories' safest seat in Wales, acknowledged today the symbolism of what it was like for Labour to take a seat like that in a place like Montgomeryshire.
I believe that the term historical result is overused, but this really is a historical result. Montgomeryshire was the only seat in Wales that had never had a Labour MP. So history has been made here tonight.
So Labour win 27 of 32 seats. That is emphatic. But alarm bells should be ringing for them, because they did so with their vote share going down to what was nearly their lowest since the post-war period. And that should worry them going into the Welsh Parliament elections in 2 years' time, where there will be now a new electoral system based on proportional representation.
Well, Andy, what about the other parties? Because it was a pretty good night for Plaid Cymru, wasn't it?
Very good night for Plaid Cymru. I was in the count in Caerfyrddin earlier this morning, where they celebrated a big gain. They won 4 seats, and that's matching their best ever. It was an excellent night for the Lib Dems. They've got a Welsh MP back in Parliament. Reform also had a very good night. They picked up something like 220,000 votes. That's a 17% vote share. And there'll be a lot of people here wondering what that might look like in a new enlarged Senedd with a PR voting system in 2 years' time. As for the Tories, the fur is beginning to fly already, with the Welsh Conservative leader, Andrew R.T. Davies, here saying repeatedly, why on earth did Rishi Sunak call an election for now?
Andy, thank you very much. Well, there's a bit of movement here in Downing Street, a sense of excitement. Behind me, there are a gaggle of supporters gathering, all looking very happy, presumably here to cheer on the new Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, as he arrives. So there is a sense that something is about to happen, and we will be Prime Minister-less for not much longer. So we'll keep you updated on that when we have it. But let's first check in on Northern Ireland, because it was also a disastrous night for the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, with Sinn Féin becoming Northern Ireland's largest Westminster party for the first time, although they don't take their seats here in Westminster, of course. And they won the same number as they did in the 2019 election, but the DUP lost 3. Among those DUP losses, Ian Paisley, who lost his North Antrim seat to the TUV, a constituency his family has held since 1970. Jane Death is in Belfast for us now. Jane.
Yes, Cathy, the DUP's bad night last night means that Irish nationalism now has the most seats at all three levels of government. The first time that's happened in Northern Irish history. Sinn Féin, the biggest party now in Westminster, at Stormont and in local government. Not because they gained on their 7 seats from 2019. They didn't have to. The DUP dropped 3, including in North Antrim, as you say, which, by the way, was not considered a marginal as the polls closed last night. Ian Paisley Jr. had a big majority there. And before him, remember, the Reverend Ian Paisley, the founder of the DUP, held the seat. So it had been in the Paisley dynasty, the political dynasty, for more than 50 years. But perhaps low turnout and disillusionment with the DUP over the after effects of Brexit was a factor. And Ian Paisley Jr. lost to the TUV. A grim-faced Ian Paisley said last night, clearly this is not the script I would have written for tonight.
Indeed, and unionism took a hit in another bastion. Tell us about that.
Yes, Lagan Valley, another unionist stronghold. I think here the Jeffrey Donaldson issue was a factor. The former DUP leader held the seat until he stepped down after he was accused of sexual offences, which he denies. And that means that a candidate from the cross-community alliance party, which is neutral on the constitutional question, took the seat. A clearly delighted Saoirse Eastwood, becoming the first non-unionist to take Lagan Valley.
I absolutely love Lagan Valley. It is my home, and I love my alliance family also. But let this be the start of a new dawn in Lagan Valley. Let this be the start of a new chapter that we will all write together as a united community.
Now, although Sinn Féin didn't increase its number of seats, they were very happy to hold on to Fermanagh and South Tyrone in the shape of a new face on the political scene, at least, Pat Cullen, the former boss of the nursing union. She was brought in to defend a very small majority of just 57. She was expected to have a close run against the UUP, but actually she turned it into a majority of more than 4,000. Michelle O'Neill very happy with that. What does the Labour government mean for Sinn Féin and Northern Ireland? Well, Sinn Féin would like a border poll, a referendum on Irish unity. Keir Starmer said that's not even on the horizon, and nor is he going to unpick the Northern Ireland Protocol. But all the parties here want to talk about funding from Westminster. The economy here is not doing well, and the health service is doing even worse.
Well, to quote a former Labour Prime Minister, I feel the hand of history on my shoulder, because this has all the echoes of 1997 when Labour supporters gathered to welcome Tony Blair into Downing Street in that landslide victory. And it's a landslide of a very similar scale today, and I just feel the echoes of the past here. It is quite extraordinary. This narrow little street, pretty extraordinary home for the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, is filling up on all sides. You've got a bank of press and cameras and umbrellas this side, and then behind me another bank of supporters looking absolutely overjoyed at their historic win last night. Well, the right-wing populist Reform UK party has now got 4 MPs in the Commons, with a surge in support in parts of the country, coming second in 98 seats. The party's leader, Nigel Farage, who originally said he wouldn't be standing in this election, succeeded on his 8th attempt to get into Parliament. Kami Nzerim is in his constituency, his new constituency of Clacton now. Kami.
That's right, Cathy. The Reform Party, Nigel Farage, they chose Clacton for a reason. Deep disillusionment with conventional, traditional party politics, heavily Brexit, high unemployment, and a lot of sympathy for Mr Farage's key policy, that in his view, the UK has far too high net migration and it needs to come down. Now, as you said, Mr Farage has been trying to get himself a seat in Westminster under a number of guises for many years. He's finally done it.
Farage Nigel Paul, Reform UK, 21,235.
8th time lucky. It's a pivotal moment in the career of Nigel Farage here in Clacton and for the fledgling party he currently leads. Reform may have been embryonic just a month ago, but it is now a mass movement, according to Mr. Farage.
Look, this is, and I said this to you on day one, this is just the first step. I set out with a goal to win millions of votes, to get a bridgehead in Parliament, and that's what we've done, so I'm very pleased.
Reform is celebrating its 4 spots in the House of Commons, but it's also condemning the UK's first-past-the-post electoral system, arguing its share of the popular vote should have resulted in many more MPs. Although they're on track to get more votes than the Lib Dems last night, it translates to just a fraction of their seats. Reform's national vote at the time of writing was 14.3%. But in the seats they won, it rose to between 35% in Great Yarmouth and 46% here in Clacton. And in a stratospheric electoral arrival, they came second in 98 seats. Mr. Farage claims Reform is now the party of the opposition.
Yeah, happy enough with it. That's who I voted for.
You voted for Mr. Farage?
Yeah.
What did you like about him?
Yeah, to make a change.
He seems like he's telling the truth. The rest waffle.
You feel like
the rest waffle like I do when I can't get the words, but they do it on purpose.
I do hereby declare that Lee Anderson is duly elected.
So who is representing Reform? Lee Anderson in Ashfield, following his defection from the Tories. Farage was elected here in Clacton, Richard Tice in Boston and Skegness, and Rupert Lowe in Yarmouth. But Reform's arrival in Parliament will bring greater scrutiny of both its policies and its coterie of fixers and supporters. So, Cathy, with 4 seats now in Parliament, possibly 5, depending on a recount later this afternoon in Basildon, Reform UK is now a credible electoral force. But during the course of the hastily arranged campaign, a number of their candidates and supporters had to be disowned by the party, by Nigel Farage, for racist and homophobic comments. Now, if Mr. Farage is going to avoid future scandals, he, as their leader, is really going to have to dig into party organisation and party apparatus. And leaving the count this morning, he had to say the following words. A, he's going to need to professionalise the party, and in his words, he's also going to need to get rid of a few idiots.
It is midday, and if you've just joined us, Sir Keir Starmer has just arrived at Buckingham Palace. We can see the latest pictures there. His car arriving. He's with his wife, Victoria, and shortly he will get out and be greeted by the King's Private Secretary. There's the King's Private Secretary waiting there. That's the palace courtyard he's arriving in. Very formal process. You can imagine what's going through his mind now as the enormity sinks in of his historic win last night, what it means for him and his wife, Victoria. And he's spoken about the pressure on his children. There he is, the incoming Prime Minister. He's not Prime Minister yet because he needs to go in to see the King and to have a ceremony known as the kissing of hands. There's no actual kissing involved inside, of course, although Tony Blair, one of the last Labour Prime Ministers, mistook that and tripped over a carpet and almost fell on the Queen in his attempt to kiss her hands. Well, the main news this lunchtime, it is all change here at number 10, where Sir Keir Starmer will take over as Prime Minister following an historic Labour landslide. He arrived at Buckingham Palace a few moments ago, where he'll be officially asked to form a new government as Britain's 58th Prime Minister, with at least 412 Labour MPs in the Commons.
We did it! You campaigned for it, you fought for it, you voted for it, and now it has arrived. Change begins now.
Well, before he went to the palace to tender his resignation to the King, Rishi Sunak apologised to the nation and said he would also be stepping down as Conservative leader. He described his successor, Sir Keir Starmer, as a decent, public-spirited man and wished him well.
To the country, I would like to say first and foremost, I am sorry. I have given this job my all, but you have sent a clear signal that the government of the United Kingdom must change, and yours is the only judgment that matters. I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss.
Well, here is the situation right now in Downing Street. The sun has just broken through the clouds and it is now resting on the heads of these supporters who have gathered in a manner very reminiscent of the 1997 landslide when Tony Blair swept into Downing Street with his young family. And Keir Starmer and his wife Victoria will shortly arrive with their children in number 10. Let's go now to Jackie in Westminster.
Thanks, Kathy. Now, 14 years of Conservative power has ended today with devastation for the party. After its worst defeat in history, the Tories look set to begin a gruelling soul-searching process. Would the success of reform force the party to the right? Or does the need to protect itself from the Lib Dems and Labour mean that it will try to hold on to its centre ground? Simeon Brown reports.
Alan Lewin is duly elected as a Member of Parliament for the Welland-Hatfield.
For the most successful political party in history, failure on this scale is unprecedented. The Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, gone. Jacob Rees-Mogg, former leader of the Commons, gone. The Education Secretary, Gillian Keegan, gone. The Conservatives started the last Parliament with an 80-seat majority and go into the new one with 250 less, including the Justice Secretary. No governing party has ever lost more seats in living memory.
What is crystal clear to me tonight is that it's not so much that Labour won this election, but rather that the Conservatives have lost it.
It's not the outcome we wanted, but clearly the people have spoken across the country.
Tonight, the Conservative Party has taken a battering because it failed to honour the trust that people had placed in it.
So where does the party go next?
No responsibility for that?
I think from the ashes of disaster grow the roses of success.
After a bonfire of big beasts, the party's leadership choices has shrunk. 12 senior politicians currently attending cabinet have lost their seats. A record loss that also includes this former Prime Minister. Although her successor Rishi Sunak claimed responsibility for the defeat, there was no concession from Liz Truss. Her 49-day premiership was part of the turbulence the electorate has voted against. From the mini-budget to Partygate, the last 2 years has seen 3 Conservative Prime Ministers and a conveyor belt of mismanagement. But after the Conservatives' hemorrhage votes to reform, there is now an existential battle over the direction the party takes next.
There will be voices calling for a move to the right to try and absorb the Reform Party and their voters. It's worth bearing in mind that Reform's total share of the vote wasn't that much higher than UKIP's in 2015, when David Cameron won a majority. And if you move in the direction of reform, you are going to be putting off a lot of potential Conservative voters, even some existing Conservative voters.
And I do hereby declare that Kemi Badenoch is elected.
But will the leadership hopefuls who've kept their seats listen?
When you want to help people, you tell them the truth. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. And we've seen too much of that in recent years.
Whereas Kemi Badenoch has guarded against closer relations with Reform's Nigel Farage, Suella Braverman has said he may have a place in the party.
I'm sorry that my party didn't listen to you.
I have heard your anger, your disappointment, and I take responsibility for this loss.
Rishi Sunak now leaves Downing Street with the record defeat no leader wants. His party unclear of their direction, knowing that the next steps could take them even further from a return.
Well, a little interesting vignette here. Larry the cat has just wandered behind me. I think it's Larry anyway, must check that. And everybody's been handed flags here, Union flags and Welsh flags, and of course the Saltire as well. Now, Labour may have secured that huge majority, but there have been a few upsets. Last night, the Labour frontbencher John Ashworth lost his seat to pro-Gaza independent Shaukat Adam, while across the country, the Labour vote was down by as much as 15% in seats with sizable Muslim electorates. Our communities editor Darshna Swinney is in Leicester South now. Darshna. Well, John Ashworth is the highest political casualty of the rise in support for pro-Palestine independent candidates who stood on the ticket of Gaza. They have won around 4 seats across the country, and they are in mainly urban areas with a high Muslim population, like here in Leicester. Now, the issues here, the tensions over that issue have been bubbling away for quite a few months, ever since Keir Starmer first made his remarks, which seemed to suggest Labour supported a siege on Gaza. Now, although the Labour Party clarified that, they then said that they support a ceasefire, it wasn't enough. And there are many people here who've been telling me for a long time that they felt that John Ashworth just wasn't listening. And I know that he was very worried about this seat. He'd been having meetings with people in the local mosques, for example, to try and clarify Labour's position. But I've spoken to a number of people here this morning who said they felt it was time for change, that Labour had taken their vote for granted for too long. But it wasn't just Gaza. Shaukat Adam, the independent candidate who won here, also spoke about issues like the NHS, like the state of the roads here. I know that's a very big issue for a lot of people. This is what Shaukat Adam said in his victory speech last night.
This was a grassroots, community, constituency-run campaign, which is an indication to those that have been in power for so long that you cannot forget the people that you serve.
There are other candidates, for example, in Dewsbury and Batley, Iqbal Mohammed won there. It's the first time an independent has won that Yorkshire seat since 1907. Elsewhere, Adnan Hussain is now the new MP for Blackburn. He only decided to start campaigning 6 weeks ago, but people there were saying that such was the strength of feeling on this issue, they knew he would win. It wasn't uniform. For example, George Galloway lost in Rochdale. Many people were surprised by that. He had stood on the pro-Gaza ticket. There were criticisms of the way some campaigners had conducted themselves. This is what Jess Phillips said. She came very close to losing her seat in Birmingham. This is what she said.
I will carry on with my speech. I understand that a strong woman standing up to you is met with such reticence. Anyway, this election has been... Can you throw them out?
So very fractured relations in some areas between the Labour Party and voters who previously considered themselves loyal. And that is something Keir Starmer will have to address in the coming days and weeks and months. Well, while Labour's sweeping election victory has rewritten the history books, the Green Party has also been celebrating its most successful result ever, winning 4 seats. Joining us now is the party's co-leader, Carla Denyer, the new MP for Bristol Central. Carla Denyer, an historic night for you personally and your party.
That's right, and I want to start by saying an enormous thank you to everybody who voted Green in our 4 target seats, where we've now got 4 brand new Green MPs and all over the country. This has been an historic result for us in terms of the number of MPs, but also the vote share, the number of second places, and I expect it'll be the number of deposits saved as well. This really feels like the Green Party's moment of coming of age. It comes off the back of 5 consecutive local elections of massive gains as well. So we've known for a while, voters have told us on the doorstep they really like Green Party policies, they want to see more Greens elected. If they had a hesitation, it was around whether we could get elected, but they've seen now comprehensively at a local and national level that if they want Green policies, they can vote Green and they can get more Greens elected.
I'll come back to that voting system in just a second, but how are you going to use this moment, as you describe it, to hold Labour's feet to the fire on the environment, given you've got 4 and they've got this landslide of MPs?
Well, of course, in the long run, I would really like to see more Green MPs elected and Greens in government one day, as is the case in many countries across Europe. But we had to start where we were, and so we had an ambitious but realistic goal of quadrupling our representation, targeting 4 seats where we had a good chance of winning this time, but standing a full slate so that everyone had the opportunity to vote Green and so that we can build on that. But the reason that we had this urgency of getting 4 in now, frankly, it's because our public services are crumbling, we're in a climate emergency, we need action now, and Labour have been backsliding on many of these policies that would make the economy fairer, give people warmer, more comfortable homes, lift children out of poverty, and tackle the climate crisis. And so getting a few more Green MPs in the Commons, as we have now done, will allow us to put pressure on the Labour government, whether that's through questions, motions, amendments, work on committees, and generally taking part in and shifting the political debate about what is politically possible. For example, challenging
Let me just cut in there, Carla, if I could, because I wonder if you've learned from your previous experience. You had a solitary MP, who was in Westminster. I wonder if you've learned from that experience, because the complaints in Brighton that there were weeds growing through the pavement and rubbish uncollected. Have you learned from that?
Well, I think the councillors in Brighton and Hove Council have learnt from that and have listened very closely to what the people of Brighton and Hove want. But it's worth noting that that is just one council amongst many. The Greens are now in administration in well over 10% of councils across England and Wales. In many of those, we've been in administration for some time, and voters have liked what they've seen, and they voted for more Greens this May. For example, just up the road from here in Stroud, where Greens have been running the council jointly with other parties for over 10 years. And also in the north of England, in York, where they were got affordable low carbon housing built, won awards for that, and in Mid Suffolk, where they got Council of the Year awards. So I think voters across the country are voting Green, liking what they see, and voting for more of it.
Okay, and just briefly and finally, you've always said in the past that the voting system, first past the post, prevented you winning seats. You and Reform, to a certain extent, have overturned that conventional wisdom last night, haven't you?
I don't think we have said that the first past the post system prevents us from winning seats. In fact, we've often said the opposite, that although it is a very unfair system, the Greens can and will win under that system, and we've proved that this time around. Nevertheless, Greens always have and always will campaign for a more proportional voting system, because the one we have currently, where Labour have got a pretty low vote share, pretty small proportion of the British population actually voted Labour in this election, and yet they have an absolute landslide in the number of seats. The number of seats just doesn't match the number of votes. And the UK is almost alone in Europe in using this outdated system. So yes, we will campaign for a fairer system so that everybody's vote counts.
You may ally with Reform on that. Carla Denyer, thank you very much for joining us. Well, the people here lining up in Downing Street are those who have helped get Labour, so Keir Starmer, during the campaign, leading to this massive majority. And our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi, is with me now. It's quite an extraordinary moment here in Downing Street, isn't it, Helia?
Well, the sun's finally come out, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm feeling a bit hot for the first time.
But I think you're going to have a lot of new MPs, but really at the heart of the cabinet will be the relationship between the new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, and Keir Starmer. That's the relationship between number 10 and number 11, obviously, is what created the vibe for the last Labour leadership. You had that very powerful pact that turned sour rather publicly between Blair and Brown. Osborne and Cameron presented themselves as a more collegiate antidote to that. But this will be a new relationship, one that's been in lockstep during opposition and most of the campaign, but they have some rather awkward decisions, Kathy.
Indeed, on tax, for example, because there were certain tax rises they didn't rule out in the campaign. Rachel Reeves says she wants to have this new model of growth powering the economy. It might not happen, and people are braced for tax rises, aren't they?
Well, we are going to get tax rises. Whether we get additional tax rises is another question. They have big challenges, for example, on welfare, where they're going to have to face up to that challenge. They have challenges on the right, as you said, when it comes to tax. Are they going to look to capital at the expense of possibly upsetting business? Remember, business is where Rachel Reeves has been focusing a lot of her attention to get the kind of investment that we haven't seen in the UK for years that is going to deliver that growth. But awkward decisions, and with such a shallow popular vote, they're going to have to keep their eye on the politics of this. And remember, they've committed not just to no more austerity, but also to rather strict fiscal rules as well, Kathy.
And quite apart from the economy, the weight of that in-tray that Keir Starmer will face and get to work on as soon as he arrives in a very short while now is extraordinary, isn't it? Multiple crises, from the multiple conflicts around the world to climate crisis we've just been hearing from the Greens. It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we're waiting to see what they do on housing. They've signposted that they're going to come out immediately as soon as they're in office and make some reforms. You know, they don't have money, this government. What they're offering is a lot of reviews and reforms. So if that gets you excited, if that gets you fist pumping, you know, like the people behind us, then this could be an interesting government. They're suggesting that they're going to make really quite massive changes to planning regime that's going to get Britain building. And for generation rent, that might be very welcome news.
Parliament gathers for the first time next week, this totally new look Parliament. More new MPs probably than at any time in a generation. And then the King's speech follows the week after.
Yes.
Lots of policies in there, particularly we would have thought the tackling the small boats crisis, because with the reform, you know, the number of seats they've won, they will want to hit that early on, won't they?
I think, you know, immigration and the small boats have been problems that have beset the last government. I think it's a question of what they want to do. Don't forget that the British government has had as a explicit policy the fact that they want to increase, you know, education exports, for example. That has led to a lot more liberal policies when it comes to students. You know, some of the paradoxes that you've seen in recent years is that immigration, the legal kind of immigration, has actually only spiked to record levels since Brexit, not before. So that, as you said, on their intro, we'll also be keen, Kathy, to know when the budget is. We want a timetable on that to see, is there a spending review? When will that budget be to tackle some of those issues? And will we get more of those tax rises, as you say?
And one of those flagship policies that we're waiting for the budget for is VAT on private school fees, isn't it? We're expecting all of that to sort of happen in the autumn. Very short summer holiday. Keir Starmer's signalled to his MPs that it will just be a few weeks off over August, then they'll be back at work in September for that budget and spending review.
Well, we don't know. We want to hear from them what the spending review will be. Will it be a multi-year spending review? In their manifesto, there was lots of big promises about making timelines much more extended, being much more long-termist on all sorts of budgets, from R&D budgets to local authority budgets. You know, so I think those critical decisions will be important.
Just pause for a second, because I think we can now go to a picture of, there you have it, the new Prime Minister shaking hands with the monarch, the King, and that is the moment at which he becomes the 58th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And that is the kissing of hands. No kissing involved, as I said earlier. He appears not to have tripped over that carpet, as Tony Blair did in the past. But that is the moment of history. The passing of the baton, Helia, is pretty... I mean, you really feel it here in Downing Street, don't you?
There's definitely some excitement here. Lots of people. I don't think I've ever seen it so crowded. But again, I would return. I mean, I hate to be the economics correspondent that keeps returning to
you
things
are
that
a party pooper,
I'm
aren't
a
you?
little bit of a party pooper, which is they need to actually make some changes, because this is day one. And if they want to, with that very shallow popular vote, they are going to have to prove to the country, because at home people will care about, is my life simply getting better? And Labour need to find the policies to make that happen.
Right, we thought we saw some movement at the Palace. We're going to try and bring you those pictures as soon as we have them. But just to return to your party pooperness, Helia, while we wait for that, the joyful moment where the supporters all cheer. The spending review you were talking about, and actually the assumption is, if you look at their spending plans, they will have to cut spending in a whole lot of departments.
Well, that's what the IFS says, Kathy.
The Ministry of Justice.
You know, the IFS. Well, we've got very interesting trend lines going on as a kind of big picture problem, which is that for most of the 20th century, defence spending was coming down while NHS spending was going up. You know, for the first time, you're going to have NHS spending going up and defence spending going up. How are we going to do this? As you were referring to just a moment ago, the IFS has warned that the current plans imply spending cuts in the work, both from an investment side. Remember, investment is the thing that essentially makes the economy grow faster, hopefully, and also in terms of unprotected departments. Rachel Reeves has promised me and other journalists, and indeed the country many times, no more austerity. But how are they going to square that circle?
And particularly in something like the Ministry of Justice, where the prisons are over overflowing, for example. And let's remind ourselves, a lot of the people, including Keir Starmer, who's going to walk into that door any minute, have not served in government before. So Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer, this is all new to them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, but they will have to start very quickly, Cathy. You know, I don't think they're going to be given much leeway. You've got to think that there's a master plan. There is a grid at work. There will be a flurry of announcements for what they want to do with reviews. As I said, we're expecting something on housing, and you were talking about the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, going to see NATO very soon.
Helia Ebrahimi, thank you very much.